CityCast from Explocity.
The juggler swallowed a sword like water, drinking it as a thirsty man would drink sherbet. He also thrust a knife up his nostril. He mounted a little wooden horse and rode in the air. Large bodies were made to issue out of small ones. An elephant was drawn through a window, and a camel through the eye of a needle. Sometimes the jugglers transformed themselves into angels, sometimes into demons. They sang enchantingly. The 14th century writer, mystic, musician, poet, and possible inventor of the sitar, Amir Khusrau was the greatest chronicler of the Delhi Sultanate. He moved among the crowd, as one historian noted, his prose and poetry capturing the decadence and depravity of pre-Mughal India. Khusrau's world was populated by turbaned ulemas, saintly and impostor Sufi mystics, quarrelling jurists, gamblers and courtesans. There were mimics, acrobats, jugglers, conjurers, rope dancers and fortune tellers. The jugglers he describes in his poem Ashika are so dexterous in their use of swords they could split a hair in two and dissect a fly in midair. In the poem Nur Sifir, he vouches for enchanters who can bring a man killed by a snake back to life after 6 months, convert themselves into wolves, dogs and cats, extend their lives by controlling their breath, and make themselves invisible by applying a magic paste to their eyes. Writing in 1935 in the Journal of the Asiatic Society of Bengal, Kunwar Ashraf combed through the works of Khusrau and others of the period to compile a kaleidoscopic portrait of life in the Delhi Sultanate. Bazaars were filled with performing rams and monkeys, snake charmers and puppeteers. Dancing elephants amused the crowds. In the princely courts, the most skillful of jugglers executed a version of the rope trick, where a magician climbed into the air until he disappeared. Soon his limbs rained down and were collected by his wife, who threw them into a funeral pyre and then committed sati by consigning herself to the flames. A short while later the magician reappeared and demanded to know what had happened to his wife, only to see her emerge from the zenana quarters of the ruler's palace unscathed. Hindu and Muslim nobles employed acrobats, mountebanks, professional jesters, buffoons and clowns to entertain their guests. Sword swallowers, conjurers, court jesters and other performance artists have been a part of the social fabric of India since the Vedic era. Over the centuries they would be celebrated and censured. These mostly itinerant show people occupied the lowest rungs of the caste hierarchy, yet they were indispensable. They were patronized by kings, queens, and the nobility for their prowess in performing exorcisms and divinations, countering the effects of inauspicious omens, dispensing life-prolonging elixirs and love charms, as well as entertaining the ministers of the court, the women of the zenana, and ambassadors from distant lands. They were an integral feature of festivals, religious rituals, and secular ceremonies, their skills codified in the sacred list of the 64 essential arts. Travellers and chroniclers would leave descriptions of extraordinary feats of physical dexterity and talismanic devilry, staged in dusty village squares and the cool marble courtyards of palaces and havelis. Their wonder-working abilities were celebrated in literature and poetry. Magicians appeared in Hindu dramas bearing bunches of peacock feathers to cast spells and executed feats of legerdemain. As early as the 7th century BCE, universities such as Taxila offered a curriculum that included the study of magic charms, knowledge of spells for bringing the dead back to life, and understanding animal cries, snake charming, and the treatment of snake bites, as well as divination, archery, elephant lore, and medicine.
History was never considered to be a subject that could lead to gainful employment, and I dare say, rewarding matrimony. Maybe that's why we have paid little respect to it in India. And maybe that's why our public records are shoddy. Most museums and public places of history disrespectfully maintained extremely poorly funded, and shabby when compared to those in other countries. Through the ages, the lasting history of India has been mainly discovered and recorded by travelers from overseas, from Megasthenes in 300 BC to Masudi in 950, Thomas Roe, 1615, and then so many other illustrious people during and since. And now a sudden interest in Indian history. Of the numbers of books that publishers send me to consider for this podcast, a great many have been about Indian history in one form or another. This interest in Indian history, I guess, was kicked off by recent Western historians, but the trend is carried forward by so many wonderful Indian historians and writers, each compelling, entertaining, and insightful. So it's all good. It's a great time to be discovering ourselves. And maybe this will cause our public spaces to improve as well. And I pray, curated by historians and other men and women of science, and not politicians. My guest today is John Zubrzycki. He is the author of several books on Indian history. His most recent book is titled The Shortest History of India. He artfully presents the thousands of years of the history of India in a little over 200 pages. His earlier book, Jadwalas, Jugglers and Jinns, is an amazing history of the little-known but truly fantastic contribution of India to the world of magic, to such a degree that Western magicians believed that they needed to dress up as Indian mystics to be credible to Western audiences. There's so much to ask him, so let's get right to it. Here he is, joining me now from his home in Australia, John Zubrzycki. Welcome to the Literary City.
It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm thrilled because I've discovered this wonderful podcast, which I hadn't known anything about before, but I'm going to be an avid fan of it from now on.
Thank you. You're very kind. And to count you among our regular listeners would be an honor.
Thank you.
So you're joining us from your home in, where exactly are you?
I'm in rural New South Wales. I'm sort of midway between Sydney and Canberra on a large farm with my nearest neighbour more than a kilometre away. So it's a perfect place to for a writer to live.
Is the name of your town Paradise?
Yes, it's very, very quiet. Yes.
Sounds lovely to me. Okay, straight to your book now. The title is Shortest History of India. Now, is that not a contradiction in pursuit of a fact?
Look, I mean, I'm sure there are shorter histories than mine, but when I was researching the book, and I did, I actually picked up several copies of other supposedly short histories of India, and I found that some concentrated more on the cultural side of things, some concentrated more on certain periods, some started later than others. I felt like I really wanted to do something that was going to be comprehensive, that was really going to be, the book, I mean, it spans 5,000 years of history. In fact, it probably spans more because I talk about the arrival of, the out of Africa migration to India, which was about 65,000 years ago. But, I wanted to, it's impossible to condense that much history into, less than 300 pages. And in fact, my publisher wanted it to be even shorter. And it was just, we cut out every extraneous word that we could. We made sure we weren't going to be drowning the readers in just facts and figures and piling dynasties on top of dynasties just to make, which would just, you would feel suffocated by all of this information. We wanted to put I was asked to put a human face to this history as much as I could to make it as accessible as it could be, but yet maintaining a sort of scholarly undertone.
Right. Well, there are those in India who want to condense it even more.
Yes, unfortunately.
Dispense with those pesky Mughals.
Yes. Squeeze out that.
As a historian, you have two stages of your work, researching it and then presenting it in prose. Now, to be a published historian is necessarily to be a good storyteller. So do you always look for the entertaining when you research?
It doesn't have to be necessarily entertaining, but it's got to be something that will resonate with you'd hope with the reader, add substance color, context, to whatever you're trying to convey. Look, my journalism, my background is as a journalist. I spent probably about 30 years as a journalist, and so I was. That's a great training ground.
Yeah, definitely.
Because it makes you have to be concise, you have to be fast, and you have to, when you're out in the field, getting stories, talking to people, you've got to be, accuracy is obviously very important, but so is drawing, interesting things out of your subjects.
Right. Now, as a journalist, you would be adept at writing. As a historian, do you enjoy the research?
Look, I mean, there are different stages. Again, the shortest history of India was a little bit different because I didn't have to rely on primary sources, hardly at all. I mean, I read a lot of journal articles. Of course, I read a lot of books. I read a lot of newspaper reporting, particularly coming closer to the present day. But with my other books, they've almost entirely been based on archival research. I mean, the passage I read out at the beginning, which is from Jadwala's Jugglers and Jinns, A Magical History of India. I scoured archives in Delhi, Bombay, Calcutta, London, New York. In the Library of Congress, I was looking through the Houdini collection. To piece together all these things, and that for me is the most thrilling part of writing books. Is going into an archive. I remember in Bombay, for instance, in the Maharashtra State Archives, very ramshackle. It's very sad to see the condition of the documents in some of these archives. It's just not being looked after at all. But I pulled out a file on a group of jugglers, magicians, who were being sent off to Paris for the Paris Exposition in 1900. And lo and behold, who was organizing that? That was Motilal Nehru, of all people.
Imagine.
So I'm seeing the original letter from Motilal Nehru, the patriarch of the Nehru Gandhi dynasty, who's taken a sort of a bit of a detour from his legal practice to become the P.T. Barnum of India, seeking permission from the British government to send a party of 60 jugglers, to Paris, for this Paris exposition. He's become an entertainment entrepreneur suddenly. There's money to be made. He's got a license to sell liquor in Paris. And 60 million people will pass through the turnstiles. It's extraordinary. And most of them would have made a beeline for his jugglers. So there you come across this thing, and you're the first person who's seen it, because what a great story. Yeah, fantastic. So that's for me. That's as a writer, that's what's the most thrilling part of being a writer is that sort of thing. But then the shortest history of India was thrilling too, because it gave me a chance to go back over what I'd learnt and read about and studied over the years. So it was terrific as well.
It's fascinating what surprises history throws up. Now, when I've read the histories of the US, or take Europe, for example, indeed Islamic history, I get the sense that there has been some kind of movement in those histories, as if they were headed somewhere.
Mm.
On the other hand, when I read Indian history, it seems to be more like a record of existence, about things that have been geographically rooted and time-specific, not a sense of movement. And then you have to connect the dots to make sense of it. Do you get what I'm saying?
Yeah, I get what you're saying. Yes. And look, connecting the dots is terrific as well. You have to do that in order to make it readable as well. For instance, when I was writing my first book, The Last Nizam, which was about Hyderabad, which was India's was premier princely state. I mean, there was only one ruler who was called by the British His Exalted Highness. I mean, he had a 21-gun salute and all of this sort of stuff. But what struck me was that I had. No one had really done a comprehensive history of Hyderabad, of course, but no one had ever done a book that looked at the state as a whole and put all of its history together. And so I that's what I tried to do that, because I in order to tell the story of the last Nizam, Mukram Jah, and what happened to him, you needed to understand the story of what had happened in Hyderabad before that. It was a great power in itself, and yet nothing had been, no one had bothered to write that history in a comprehensive way.
Right. So, the history of Hyderabad is a whole book in itself. And that's the impression that I got from reading the shortest history of India, is that everything that you mention in your book is actually an entire book in itself. And maybe that would give it the movement. But let's go back to the beginning. Harappa. How important is Harappa?
Oh, Harappa is extremely important. I mean, it was the greatest civilization of its day. But this was a seemingly egalitarian, quite secular state, which had trading links with countries as far away as Egypt, the Gulf, Central Asia, and so on. It was an extremely well-organized society. When you look at the uniformity of town, of the town planning, whether it's Mohenjo-daro or a site in Gujarat, or even as far west as Afghanistan. I mean, it's you've got set widths for streets. You've got the same sets of public buildings and so on. So it was an extraordinary civilization, spread out over a vast geographical area. I mean, greater than Egypt and Mesopotamia, those civilizations combined. Yet it maintained some sort of a structural integrity, and how they could have achieved that in so long ago is mind-boggling. It's fascinating for me. I guess it's a great starting point for the study of India. Yes.
Right. Starting point for the study of Indian history. You wrote that William Brunton discovered Harappa only as recently as 1856. And once he found it, then the Archaeological Survey of India came into it and everything changed. And Harappa became the fount of all Indian history and learning. But how did they teach Indian history before that?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, it was a large part until writing was introduced into India. We had no historical sources. Everything was oral history, and you can deduce certain historical figures, or you can certainly deduce something about the structure of society, the structure of the religion, and all these sorts of things, which are very important to an understanding of that early Indian history. But yeah, so it was, it wasn't before the discovery of the Harappan civilization, it was a big, big black hole.
Right. One of the most interesting things about the shortest history of India is that sometimes it just gives you context in a very pithy way. For instance, you mentioned that the period between 320 and 500 was the Golden Age, the Gupta period. And the book has very interesting information as to why that was the Golden Age. And I will leave it for people to buy the book and read that for themselves. No spoilers. Also, your book mentions another very interesting William Jones. On page 61, you talk about him, and he founded the Asiatic Society in Kolkata, and he's buried in a cemetery in that city. We don't really know enough about William Jones. Tell us a little bit more about him.
Oh, look, I mean, he was a polymath. I can't remember now how many languages he spoke, but it was quite extraordinary. He wrote a history of Persia, Persian language dictionary. He came to India to take up a posting as a judge, but was clearly fascinated by the country, and he realized that as a judge, he realized that to gain a proper understanding of Indian law and dispense justice fairly, he needed to understand the Sanskrit language. So he found himself a teacher, and it was while studying Sanskrit that he started to make this link between Sanskrit and the Indo-European languages. and as you say, founded the Asiatic Society, and started making these great contributions to our understanding of early Indian history.
To me, he was one of the most interesting characters in your book. Now, in your book, you have a sidebar titled The Gupta Gambit. It's all about chess, and I'm a chess player, very amateur. And William Jones, did you know that he had written a chess poem?
No, I didn't.
He wrote this poem, Kaisa, when he was 17 years old, and this was in 1763. There's a very nice reading of that poem in the archives, and I'll put up a link in the podcast description. In your book, Jaduwalas, Jugglers, and Jinns, a couple of points stand out for me, and one of them is the great Indian rope trick. And I quote this passage from your book. Whether the rope feat was an Oriental Jack in the Beanstalk or just hocus pocus, it would become the most debated subject in corridors and meeting rooms of magic societies in the first decades of the 20th century. And then there's this description of Ibn Battuta in Cortes' court, watching this illusion. A guy climbs up the rope, goes after his apprentice who already climbed the rope, and throws the apprentice's body parts to the ground and then brings him back to life. You say that this had a profound effect on Ibn Battuta?
It did, yeah. I think he had to be revived with smelling salts or something like that. He fainted whenever he saw that happening, yes. As you would. I mean, I think I would as well. But I mean, I have actually seen some pretty gory magic being performed, including when I was traveling through Bengal in the early 70s and seeing a magician skewer his young assistant with a knife through the neck and hold him up.
Wow!
For all of us to see, and as far as I could see, and I was standing just maybe a meter away from him. There was no trickery involved. It was a real knife going through his neck. But it's the Indian rope trick. It's the most iconic of all Indian magic tricks, and but it all started with a piece of fake news, of course, in the Chicago Tribune when a couple of journalists went to India and pretending that they had seen this trick performed, but it was all part of a trick to get people to buy more copies of the newspaper. It was fake news. It never happened, and but by the time the newspaper issued a correction or an apology, it had gone viral. Now, this is the 1890s, so it means that it's gone.
Twitter.
Yeah, there's no Twitter, there's no internet, no YouTube, but this was something that really captured the public's imagination and really put India front and center of the magic world in the early part of the 20th century.
And then there's some great stuff about P.C. Sarkar.
Yes.
In your chapter, though, you have him on the back foot all the time on account of the troubles that the Western magicians gave him. It didn't help that he called himself the greatest magician ever. In response to which, there was this funny line in your book where you quote George Johnston, who said, "My ego was bruised as I was under the assumption that I was the world's greatest. I stated that his claim was as ridiculous as Sophia Loren complaining that Twiggy had stretched her sweater."
Look, if there's anything, magicians have got a great sense of humor. I mean, they have to be. They're actors after all.
Right, they are entertainers.
They're entertainers. They're show men and women. I mean, mostly men, unfortunately, but they're just show people. They're entertainers. I mean, that's how you do it.
And Sarkar was no slouch in that department, was he?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, he had the audacity to call himself the world's greatest magician even before he'd left Bengal, and he had a tremendous ego, and he was very competitive. I mean, he was very, he was a great showman. Magicians you talk to who remember him will say that he was a great showman, but he wasn't a particularly good magician. He was an illusionist, so he could, if you've got, 60 tons of props, which is what Sarkar would travel with, you could just about make anything happen. I think he famously made the Taj Mahal disappear. I think he made the Frontier Trail disappear, all this sort of stuff. So
Yeah, he did make the Taj disappear. Now, if only the present government could hire him now.
Exactly. Yes.
Now, for our listeners, there's a link in the podcast description to where you can buy The Shortest History of India and Jadwala's Jugglers and Jinns, and through there, other work by John Zubrzycki. Speaking of your books, you started with the book about the Nizam of Hyderabad, and now we're here. Take us through the books that you've written.
Look, The Last Nizam was about Mukram Jah, the eighth Nizam of Hyderabad. And then from then, and then while I was writing that book, there was a character in that book, Alexander Malcolm Jacob, who sold sixth Nizam, what was then called the Imperial Diamond, 183 carats, so almost twice the size of the Koh-i-Noor. And I thought, wow, this is an interesting character. What a fantastic story. And then, as I said, he dabbled in magic. So that drew me to Indian magic more generally and the Jadwala's story. And then after that, I was asked by Juggernaut publishers to write about the history of the Jaipur royal family, or the contemporary history, really.
And then we have The Shortest History of India. And finally, a cliched question. What's next?
Look, I've got a list of ideas for books on India, which is as long as the rope that the magicians throws into the air. Just to give you an example, I'd love to write a history of the archaeological survey of India, of the discovery of India. But I am also working on a book on the integration of the princely states. So from 5,000 years of history into 300 pages, I'm now trying to condense the story of 562 princely states into whatever it's going to be, 350, 400 pages, and what happened to them in the lead up to independence and immediately after. Some of your listeners would be familiar with V.P. Menon's work on the story of the integration of the Indian princely states. But what I've discovered is that there's so much more to the story. I mean, his is a very sanitized version. And the behind the scenes of what was going on in the crucial period between, in the lead up to independence, where, there's the Hyderabad story is well known,
right?
Kashmir story is well known, the Junagadh story is well known, but there was lots of other. The whole process was extremely messy. These princes, these rulers, were promised a lot of things. That they'd retain their titles, that they'd retain their kingdoms, that they'd not be integrated, and so on. And every single promise that was ever made was broken. So that's what I'm working on now. That'll be the next book that comes
Already,
out.
I can't wait to read it. And maybe you'll come back on the show as a guest when you've written that book.
Oh, I hope so. Yeah.
And in anticipation, John Zubrzycki, thank you so much for being my guest today on The Literary City.
Thank you, Ramji. That's been a pleasure.
And that was John Zubrzycki, the author of The Shortest History of India, available everywhere. And I'll be back with that fun segment, What's That Word?, where we look at words and phrases that we use all the time, but never stop to think about. And I'm back with What's That Word? And to help me with it, my co-host, here she is.
Hello. My name is Pranati, but you can call me P. That's P with an A, not another E.
Hello, P with an A. And what tricks do you have up your sleeve today?
Wait, so from that question I can tell that you already guessed correctly.
What did I guess?
My pick for What's That Word today?
Yes, I think I did. But what is it?
You tell me.
Magic?
That's right. How did you know? How did you guess?
Well, I figured that you would have been intrigued by John Zubrzycki's book, Jadwala's Jugglers and Jinns, and that's all about the history of magic.
Yeah, Zubrzycki's book seems so fascinating. Clearly you read it, and that was a great interview. I mean, I just didn't want it to end.
And thank you. And it is a fascinating book. I had no idea there was so much history in that subject. Imagine Motilal Nehru booking juggling acts in Paris.
Yeah, that was amazing. And I can't wait to read the book.
And you know what? You should also read his more recent book, The Shortest History of India. I mean, it's more than merely a précis of the whole thing.
Not just listicles, right?
No, no. No, although he does have a rather convenient timeline with years and events right up front.
That's great. But before we move on to magic, I liked that comment about the title of his book, The Shortest History of India.
Now, what did I say?
You said a contradiction in pursuit of the truth.
Yes. Well, honestly, I have no idea what I meant by that.
Yeah, right. Okay, so you believe in magic then?
Of course, every boy does.
Oh, and you think girls don't believe in magic?
Oh, yes, I think girls do, but not the same thing. They believe in a good magic. Nice things happen. I read something about unicorns passing rainbows instead of wind.
That's true. We're all about fairy tales, aren't we?
Oh, are you? Okay, good you clarified that then. Anyway, young boys don't want to learn. They want to learn magic tricks, not magic. We just want to fool people.
Oh, I believe you. I have known boys.
Yeah, there have been rumors.
Hey, not much magic there, I'm afraid.
I know, I'm sorry. We're terrible people. Okay, now to yank this conversation back from the abyss of gender studies.
Yes, let's. Actually, the phrase John Zubrzycki used was hocus pocus. But I want to go into the root of the word magic.
Okay, the etymology of the word magic is quite fascinating, in fact.
Cool. But let's start with the basic etymology. But first, the meaning. May I?
Of course, go right ahead.
Okay. How about magic is the power to make impossible things possible?
Yep, that's good. That's fine. And give me an example.
Well, a magician makes an assistant disappear into thin air
Right.
or is somehow able to guess a card that you picked.
True.
All this has something to do with the supernatural, doesn't it?
Yes, it's totally supernatural. And, the belief in that is why magic has found its way into just about everything around us. For example, I don't know of any religion that isn't based on this mumbo-jumbo magical things. And, from that, superstition, ritual, and of course, politics.
So true. Okay, now let's discuss the linguistics.
Sure. So the word magic has a PIE root, Proto-Indo-European root. That means it occurs in several old languages, including Greek, which has mekan, and Sanskrit that has mahan. And the root of both is mag. And it means to be able or to have power. And once we understand that, we can also understand from mag sprang things that have power, like machine and therefore mechanic.
That is super cool.
Well, and it's not a stretch to replace machine with magic and mechanic with magician.
Gee, thanks. Thanks for robbing all of the magic from this and replacing it with an auto repair shop.
Yeah, but sorry, but there is more.
Yes. How did magic find its way into the supernatural?
Those links are not obvious. Of course, they aren't. Hey, have you heard the phrase Deus ex machina?
Yes, I have. I mean, it basically, God comes from the machine.
Correct.
Yeah, it's a way to introduce an unexpected character who can solve a problem that no one else has done.
And that is the literary device, exactly. Solves an unsolvable problem as if by
Magic.
So there's no convenient record of how the word came to mean what we know it to mean today, but a likely root is the Greek word magic, M-A-G-I-K-E, and that used along with the word techni, T-E-X-N-I, comes to mean art rather than craft. So you see, it's the art of the magic. So therefore, it starts to come into the performance space. And by performance, I mean anyone who can claim to do anything that he claims it can do. That's magic, isn't it? And anyway, it was as early as the 14th century that the word magic came to popular use, according to etymologists.
Right. And it's not hard to figure out the rest of that word's journey into language.
Correct, right. But let's not forget that the practice of magic was actually way older. Think about the Bible. Even in the Old Testament, you had people doing magic tricks. And the Indian tomes are full of magical acts. But you asked about hocus pocus. So let's do that and then a few other magic-related terms.
Presto.
Immediately, sure, okay. On it. Okay, hocus pocus was first referred to in the mid-1600s, and it was used by magicians and jugglers as a chant. They'd say some incomprehensible things while doing a magic act, and it sort of added to the whole drama of the situation. But the phrase hocus pocus, they say, was a perversion of the sacramental blessing from the Mass, the Catholic Mass, which went, hoc est corpus meum. So say it in another way, hoc est corpus, hocus pocus. All right? You see that? It meant this is my body. So I'm assuming that someone imitated the intoning of the priest to make mouth noises that sound completely credible and spiritual. As if that trick that he was doing was not a trick, right? And this is my view of all religion, by the way.
I would say amen, but that would be ironic.
And terribly heretic.
Yeah. Anyway, what about abracadabra?
Also gibberish, used to give the impression of arcane knowledge or power. And this one actually is from the Hebrew word, and my Hebrew friends will forgive me this, averacadabra. And that means I will create as I speak. Anyway, there are many other words that sprang from this usage, including legerdemain and prestidigitation, and both of those to mean sleight of hand and similar dexterity. You see?
Yeah, all this is very well, but personally I prefer the spells and chants in Harry Potter.
Yes, I saw the movie. I only saw one movie of it, the first one, and they had all these spells and chants, and my little niece at the time was so taken up by this that she memorized all of them and she'd use them on me with a broom. All right? Very destabilizing. All right? And, when I was a kid, we had Merlin the Magician. He didn't do half as well as Harry Potter.
Yeah, well, all this is fascinating, and it's amazing how much of law and social convention comes from this. What can I call it? Conjecture?
Sure. Or easier, nonsense. Right? But it's useful to sway the masses. Anyway, I read this very interesting academic paper in the course of finding out about the word magic. And it's titled Witchcraft, Sorcery, and Magic. And the study quotes anthropologists who have said the same thing in two different ways. One group said that primitive people used magic as a way to explain things that could not otherwise be understood. And another group of anthropologists who are not as charitable said this is how the primitive minds perceive the world. Okay? So they said qualitatively distinct from rational thinking, they said.
Wow. Anyway, why any of this?
Well, some say that it's all about hope. Consider that all these magic-based things like chants and incantations and appeal to a higher power and supernatural power and belief in a superior alien power, all these things have one thing in common, that something up there has a solution to something beyond the capacity of a regular schmo, like a doctor. So this is why godmen are also worshipped. Rational scientists are boring.
Right. There must be a simple explanation as to why this is the case, though.
I have one. Doctors, psychologists, scientists tell you that you're screwed. All right? Godmen tell you that you aren't. Now, who would you rather believe?
Mr. Johnny Walker.
Oh, get out of here.
Hey, here's some magic. I can make myself disappear.
Promise?
Bye.
And that's our show. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you so much for listening. And I would like to thank my guest, John Zubrzycki, and my co-host, Pranati P with an A, Madhav. Now, before you go, head to wherever it is that you're listening to this podcast and hit that subscribe button and make sure that you never miss an episode of The Literary City. See you again next Wednesday.